awareness into this topic. So without much further ado, just before we go into the presentation, just a little housekeeping. Please, once you dial in, try and put your phone on mute. There will be a Q&A session just after the presentation. But if you have any questions on the Zoom itself, you could punch in your questions. We will be happy to answer your questions towards the tail end of the presentation. But towards the tail end, once it's over, we will then unmute, and those who want to ask the question to the presenter, feel free to make your questions known. Okay. Without any further ado, I want to invite our presenter. Her name is Michelle Shifunga. She's quite very experienced in the area of emerging technology, and this whole topic of blockchain, she's going to do a lot of justice to it. So, Michelle, thanks for joining today. We have a rare privilege of having you on board, and thank you. So let me just unmute you here. Sorry, just want to unmute you. Okay, you've been unmuted, Michelle.
Great, fantastic. No, thank you so much, John, for having me. And I hope everybody's keeping well. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. I assume everybody's kind of done in the UK side, but if not, good afternoon, everybody around the world. If you're plugged in, I hope you're well and safe. We are obviously in very unprecedented times, very difficult times. And it's really interesting time actually in terms of technology at the moment for all of us. So I'm hoping that, the presentation we put together here, will give a little bit of shed some light in terms of some of the opportunities that exist in blockchain and the digital economy as a whole. And just to kick off, really, one of the focus areas that we do want to look at is very much looking at how does emerging technologies or digitalization actually help in current situation, in the difficult environments that a lot of us are finding ourselves in. And just to shoot off, I thought I'd just set a little bit of context, behind what we've been looking at. And certainly as the world we know it today is a very, very different place. Not necessarily just because of the COVID crisis, which is probably on everybody's mind right now. But when we're looking into the more, the changes around the world in terms of, some of the policies across the world, how leaders across the world are approaching things in slightly different manners in different countries. So it's a very, very interesting time. But, what I find really interesting is how just almost overnight, there's been a very heavy focus by almost all countries across the world around the digital element. But of course, we're still facing issues around things like the trade wars and some border frictions, challenges around in the environment and the climate change. Although it's fair to say right now, I think the environment is booming. And we can kind of feel that. I hear the birds singing every day as I wake up. So it's a very, very interesting time. But we're dealing with inequality, demographic shifts across the world and changes and the impacts of the demographic changes that we're going to see, even with the impact of COVID and how COVID is taking away lives, especially in sort of the older generation. What does that shift mean? How do we look at digitization? What does digitization actually mean for all of us? And how do we leverage technology to look at, improving some of our business offerings as we move ahead? So our focus is very much around the digital element, but also, of course, looking into blockchain. And on that note, so we are facing a digital revolution. We have been for some time, I think, and it's a very exciting time, all across the world. I think this slide really kind of exemplifies that, this digital revolution is impacting absolutely everybody. And I think the COVID crisis has highlighted it more significantly, that digital is here to stay. In digital, if you're not with digital, then I think we need to get with digital pretty fast. But the world is evolving. There's so much things that are happening around the digital front. Certainly in certain parts of the world, like in Africa, digital isn't necessarily new to us. We looked at things like M-Pesa and other digital, platforms and payment systems that are really large in scale and are being utilized worldwide. But what does digital mean to who? They can have different meanings for different players across the world. We're looking at payments, Alipay and a whole range of other products and services that are coming out of the digital revolution. We're seeing changes in terms of the future of work, how people are working. There's a lot more homeworking. There's a lot more engagement with digital tools. Not everybody's familiar with it. How do we engage? How do we gear up? How do we skill up people so that we can all be, on the same page and not many are left behind? So I think the digital revolution is a pretty significant change to the world, and I think it's going to have a lot of impact on. And just generally around the world, this little slide I store here, really exemplifies what is happening in terms of changes around the digital spheres. How more and more younger users are looking at social media platforms and are using social media as a means of communication, as a means of engagement, as a means of socializing. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that, especially with the COVID crisis. The usage of mobile, users are increasing by the day. Internet access is increasing by the day, but of course there's still many people who are still left behind around these challenges. And of course the population, that is going to have an impact with COVID and a whole range of other issues, as we see people dying, sadly, and we start to seeing different impacts in different nationalities across the world. So it'd be very, very interesting to keep a note on that. But back to the subject that we're here to talk about today, subject I love very much, as you will discover as I go on, and it's something that I have been looking at for quite some time. A lot of you might have heard about blockchain, but, maybe in very, very different perspectives.
No, I'm not hungry.
What does it actually mean? There's a lot of buzzwords that are coming out, have been coming out for some time. The terminology blockchain itself is quite confusing. I don't necessarily like the word blockchain, you'd be surprised, because it does cause a little bit of confusion here and there. And of course, most people kind of associate blockchain with Bitcoin and a whole bunch of other things. So what does it actually mean? I like to translate it in very simplistic terms, try and make people understand. So for me, in my sort of head and how I look at blockchain is very much around value. And it's for me, I like to describe blockchain as a digital book or a ledger, if you prefer the ledger word, a digital book of records with related transactions, recorded on that, put it simply. Now, transactions are made up of blocks of data. So data is at the heart, at the core of blockchain. So the quality of data, the type of data, very, very important. And data is what fuels blockchain. So it's the transactions that are made up of blocks of data, organized in a certain order. So these blocks of data are linked together, and because they are linked together, hence forming the word blockchain. Sounds very, very complicated. It's not necessarily that complicated. So it's a blocks of data, and the advantageous thing with blockchains as well is, they kind of time stamped as those, data is inputted into those blocks. They're time stamped, and you get the same copy of the ledger or that digital book. So if that digital book says X, all people who are involved within that particular network who are using that digital book, who have access to that digital book, will get the same copy of the book. Or the same copy of records that are put on that book. Very, very important point. And this is really kind of explained very, very simply for ease of understanding. And ultimately, for me, I like to, like I said in the beginning, I like to look at it in the concept of value creation. So ultimately, it's a channel or a means or a vehicle, or a tool that you use to exchange, store, and transfer value. Now, what is value? Value comes in different forms. We value cars, you value land, you value property, you value your IP, you value your music, your royalties. All those are kinds of value. Now, those values can be, exchanged, transferred, and stored within sort of blockchain, within the data that is put onto the blockchain. The blockchain itself is like a platform, and it creates that engine of trust and transparency. To be created especially in scenarios where you have so many different players who are operating together. Very, very difficult to know who within that network. And of course, in the banking industry, all the time you're dealing with KYC, trying to understand your customers, trying to understand who is these players. You're dealing with third-party players and a whole range of different players across the spectrum. So it's very, very difficult, I think, to establish trust. And it still is very, very difficult to establish trust, especially now when we're looking at, for example, the COVID crisis and even, sort of the supply of equipment and a whole range of other things. Very, very difficult to know who is genuine, who is not genuine. There's a trust issue. Now, blockchain enables, facilitates more trusty interactions and transactions to happen between multi-players, many people who are interacting within a particular network or transaction. So, looking a bit more around what is blockchain technology. Here is really just to exemplify how it actually really works in practice, and how a transaction moves from A to B. So a transaction is broadcasted across a peer-to-peer network. So within a particular network where you have different players operating in that network, we have what you call nodes. Nodes are simply computers that are connected to one another who are part of that particular network. And those computers will communicate to each other and will have the same copy of that digital book of records, the same copy of the digital book of records. So each node or computer sees exactly the same version of events, and each party within sort of the network will be the one also validating, agreeing that this is a true copy. So there's a lot of work, or algorithms and mathematical calculations that are done by groups called miners. So those people who are doing those kind of mathematical solutions to work that out are called miners, and a part of this network will validate transactions as they come through. Now, once the validation has happened, which is done, through the various nodes or computers here, then that validation is verified, and the transaction can involve, all sorts of different things, including cryptocurrencies. A cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard about, or you've heard in the news. Cryptocurrency is a type of digital money, or payment option. But you can have on that transaction maybe contracts or records, as I said, records of transactions. So various things can be verified by this network of people who are involved in the transaction. And once that verification is done, it is combined with other transactions to create that block of data. So there's always a block of data. To create that block of data, in order to enter that block of data, it has to be verified and verified, by the group, as I explained earlier on, to be then added to the existing blockchain or the existing platform, right? And each block kind of connects to the block before, hence why linking it together and creating the blockchain. And once that happens, it's complete. Now, this is slightly more complex way of, kind of explaining it. And I think as you see through the presentation, we will be able to exemplify through examples that we have in place to show you how this actually works in practice. Now, as I said, blockchain is not only about Bitcoin. I know a lot of people, yes, I've been called all sorts of names across the world, actually. Hi, Michelle, here's the Bitcoin girl. The Bitcoin girl is here to talk to us about Bitcoin. Blockchain isn't necessarily just about Bitcoin. How I like to think about it, blockchain is the underlying technology, it's the mother technology, and you have Bitcoin as one of those kids. One of those kids might sometimes be a little bit disruptive here and there. We're looking at valuation, we're looking at a whole range of things when it comes to Bitcoin, and a lot of people are familiar with the trading that goes on with Bitcoin, the fluctuation, volatility that goes on with Bitcoin. But blockchain, the underlying technology, has a lot more to offer. And it's just a case of understanding how to leverage the technology. So blockchain is very much more around the mother technology, or the underlying technology, whereas Bitcoin is the digital money that you can enable to operate, or the first decentralized application resulting from blockchain. Now, there are different types of blockchains, of course. You have what we call private and public blockchains. I'm sure the members in this audience, and I apologize for those who might be already familiar with the fundamentals or the basics of blockchain. But these are really important elements, I think, to gain an understanding of how it works. And we have different types of blockchains. You've got private and public blockchains. Public blockchains are the ones that are based on open source code that is used. And with most public blockchains, you have permissionless, so many people can access the network, can play around on the network. So things like Bitcoin and Ethereum are open source public blockchains that you can go and actually see the source code and start to interact that way. But you also have private blockchains, and in many cases, a lot of the banks who are involved in consortia and a whole range of other private initiatives are leveraging private blockchains. And here with private blockchains, you have certain parties who have access rights, into those private blockchains. So it's almost like a closed network of different nodes, those computers I mentioned, or parties that are involved within particular transactions who have access to this private blockchain. Very, very popular in areas like healthcare, where you have sensitive data, sensitive information that you don't necessarily share publicly. And these are becoming used, more and more, especially around things like, even enterprise blockchain solutions. You see a lot of private blockchains. So blockchain for banking, I think there's a lot of opportunities in terms of banking. I hear a lot of criticism sometimes when I am speaking publicly about how banks need to be, replaced by fintechs and how the world is changing. But there's still an ultimate very, very strong role for the banking industry. And the banking industry has played a huge role in terms of facilitating finance and helping to support economies. But the world is changing. The world is changing. There's a lot more innovation going on within the space, within the banking space, and a whole range of others. And I'm very, very familiar in terms of what the banking industry itself is looking at around things like open banking and a whole range of other innovative opportunities. Now, in terms of opportunities with blockchain for banking, it's, you will not be unfamiliar, I think many of you, in terms of looking at how blockchain impacts by, fast transactions, looking at clearances, settlement systems, more efficiency around buying and selling assets in a slightly different manner, credit and loans, and doing that more transparently, and maybe, using more trust systems. The supply chain is a huge one. Accounting and auditing. And each one of these we will go through in a little bit more detail as we progress. But these are areas where you can see very kind of significant traction as we've gone ahead in terms of blockchain, how blockchain is impacting in these areas. So faster payment. Certainly, I think in terms of when you're in blockchain technology, where there's a lot more transparency and the players within the network are able to see, same versions of that digital records of transactions. You're able to move transactions quicker than you have in the past. Then you have faster transactions, and the banks can leverage blockchain to enable a lot more faster transactions by dealing with things like KYC, AML, much easier by leveraging blockchain to try and do that. Very, very important. When you're looking at clearance and settlement systems as well, very, very important. Banks, won't need to rely necessarily on just the SWIFT network. They could simply settle transaction directly using, public blockchain, for example, and almost cutting out a lot of the middlemen. By doing that, using blockchain, you're building trust. You're opening up transparency and traceability as well, which is really, really significant. So there isn't necessarily just one central point, but instead you're using the blockchain or the code as a source of verifying and auditing, be it documentation and a whole range of other things, which will improve settlement times and processes as well. In terms of logistics, I think blockchain is pretty critical here, and I think the COVID crisis has actually really amplified this. Blockchain in logistics is really, really huge. How does it work in logistics? You're reducing that paper-based documentation by digitizing and automating a lot of the process as you go along. Providing sort of standardized freight documentation, for example, very, 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 core and relevant. And connecting different players together, I think, is critical. So where you have across the supply chain, you're dealing with the lawyer, the insurer, the banker, so many different parties. It's very, very difficult sometimes to verify and work more efficiently and fast in terms of delivering what you're trying to provide. So very, very important in terms of look at how do we leverage the technology to enable us to work slightly faster. Here, you have the opportunity of using things like smart contracts, and with smart contracts where you can actually enable, contracts to be embedded into your processes and systems, be it AML, to give certain instructions, and obligations to do things at certain points will help expedite some of the services that you're providing as well. But also in terms of actual use cases, where has it actually been used around logistics? Improving shipping process efficiency takes quite a while. Invoicing and payments, how do we speed that up by leveraging the technology? Better transparency, inventory tracking, And integrating blockchain into, for example, existing IT systems that you have, your backend. You'll hear a lot more about that a lot later on as we progress in the presentation. But also using different use of, data storage, by using the blockchain, which is offers a lot more security by that consensus that you have to get, that agreement you have to get from the network, from the different players within the network. If you can get that agreement from the different players, then you're creating a lot more secure opportunity. So it's not just one central point. It's not just the government or bank that is saying to you, yes, we verify that Michelle Chivunga is Michelle Chivunga and that she has all this, the right documentation and all that. My information, my details that I provide can be shared across the network, across different parties to verify who I am. Right, and that data is stored securely on the blockchain securely without necessarily sharing my personal information. So you can have data that is put onto the blockchain in those blocks of data I talked about, which doesn't have to reveal, my exact details, but gives a particular code that is linked to myself that tells anyone who needs to know anything about me within the permissioned blockchain, if you want, if it's a private blockchain, the insurer, the bank, or the mortgage provider that I'm trying to get a mortgage from, has the same copy, the same view of who Michelle is, and that detail, that documentation is available as and when needed, which is pretty critical. And now, in terms of success factors, certainly in terms of improving blockchain capabilities and knowledge is something that we need to look at a little bit more. Creating those value engagement with the stakeholders across the world, the technology certainly helps with that. And then also building that culture of collaboration. I think the technology, because it is a trust and sort of easy and transparent way of seeing things, then you're starting to create those strong collaborations and relationships with parties within the network. So that's on logistics. Here we really try to exemplify, the impact of maybe introducing blockchain solution into some of these areas where, of course, in the banking industry, you'd have to work a lot on, and the amount of time it takes to actually get these, processed. And the settlement days, level of settlement days, it takes much longer, I think, when you're using sort of current offerings. Whereas you start to bring in blockchain, you can see that the reduction in terms of days, in terms of processing some of these areas is very powerful. And now we're starting to see a lot more complex products coming out in the decentralized markets. So in the decentralized finance, for example, loans are starting to be looked at and collateralized or pegged to Ethereum or a whole range of other things. So some very innovative things that are coming out. How do we, how does the banking industry start to look at how to digitize and almost innovate around these offerings? We're looking at things like, COVID and what is happening with COVID offering in terms of the financial markets, how it's very difficult, for example, to access capital to buy the right equipment that you need. How can we innovate and leverage technology to try and do that? Very important. And of course, we have seen over time, the efficiencies that come with using the technology. So whether it be the reduction of days or in the actual costs reductions as a result of maybe you're not paying as much high transaction fees. It's not taking 20-30 days to process, a particular bond. You have immediate view of sort of KYC, ML, and a whole range of other compliance areas, which will enable you to expedite what you're doing a little bit faster. Credit and loans I have touched up on a little bit, but the future is very much around sort of peer-to-peer loans, faster and more secure loan processing in general, and even in complex programmed loans than that, to look at sort of syndicated loan structures or mortgages. Mortgages is a big one. I think in the UK alone, for example, first-time buyers access to the mortgage market still is very difficult. How do you enable that? You enable them to get the right access of finance in order for them to buy their first home. the average age of a first-time buyer has increased and increased over time. And part of the challenge has been actually access that deposit, the finance needed to get that deposit going. Where's the transparency within the mortgage market to try and understand actually who are the players offering what in terms of, mortgages, who are the players, in terms of looking at the overall housing market, housing structures, what housing have we got in place in terms of buying. You can put all that information, that data that you have on the mortgage market, for example, onto the blockchain, and you have the different, funders, investors, and different schemes that are in place to support first-time buyers, perhaps on the blockchain, a whole range of other options that you can explore. And by that technology itself, it's not a magic wand at all. And I know a lot of people seeing there's a lot of buzz and hype around blockchain and how it can solve almost everything. No, it's actually with blockchain, you have to look at the practicalities and say, where can it actually apply? It is a very good storage mechanism, a slightly more secure storage mechanism. It's not totally mutable, i.e. you cannot change everything that's on the blockchain. Yes, it's a lot more secure because you have to gain that consensus from a whole range of different parties within a network or players within the network. So it makes it slightly more secure. But I always argue that it's never 100% secure. And in fact, I'll touch up on that a little bit later on. But a whole range of different products can come into play using the technology as I outlined. So supply chain. Supply chain is a big one, like I said earlier on, and I think we've seen more and more examples of that, especially with the COVID crisis. You can see the differences here in terms of, the current supply chain and how that's working, and it's a little bit kind of distorted here and there. And all through across different areas, there are problems or challenges, even logistical challenges as we go through this, current supply chain bit. But when you move on and introduce a blockchain, it becomes a little bit more easier and more seamless to do business, but also not just necessarily in terms of ease, but also having sort of product details and sharing that same copy of information that can be accessed in real time by different players across the network is very, very important. Yeah, so this expedites in terms of delivery of supply chain goods. You're able to verify and identify products as and when they travel different across the supply chain. And this helps to create, I think, also to open up opportunities for real value creation. Back to my point around how I like to look at blockchain as a value engine. With blockchain, it's not necessarily, yes, it's good for storage. Yes, you can have all this information that's stored in the blockchain and it sits there. But what is the actual value in it? If you're able to actually, do things a little bit faster, yes, and create some value, but also helping those different players within the supply chain to actually start accessing value and creating value and untapping that value much, much faster at less cost is very, very important. And you will see as we go along the slides how that has impact. So just to give a bit of an example here, to drill down in a little bit more detail here in terms of, getting a good from A to B, for example. So the supplier has a product that obviously they want to try and ship off. The supplier gives the product, has a code or RFID code within that product, and the manufacturer will receive that product and verifies using that QR code that the information, the supply and the specs that's been given on that product is legit. And then that process moves on to the distributor, who again has the same view of the information that is there. And that distributor will obviously select a service provider. It could be DHL and a whole range of others to distribute that product. A service provider is able to see also the same view of the information, the product information, and a whole range of other things. And that distributor is able to ship that good or service to the retailer, and the retailer as well has the same copy, the same information within their records and can verify what's going on using the QR code and a whole range of other things that have followed through. And then from the retailer, obviously you're moving these goods to a store, and the store manager, people will have to verify and say, okay, does this order fit, for example, current market demands with COVID, for example? How much are we going to start selling those trainers? How much are we going to promote the sales? But because they have that audit trail of the journey of that product or service, you can almost see the spec and where it's coming from, the value, the quality, it makes it easier, I think, for that store owner to start looking at sort of promotion and sales and a whole range of other things. And of course, when it ends in our hands as clients, we scan that QR code that's attached to that product, and we're able to track and trace where that product's coming from. This is in terms of provenance, for example, for food. Increasingly, as you know, we face the coronavirus at the moment, most of us are going to be very wary about where our stuff is coming from, how real, valid our stuff is coming from, how can we authenticate and say, yes, this is genuine, for example, organic. How can we tell that? I think by looking at sort of the audit trail, that information that has been tracked and placed on the blockchain, and having that information, you can verify and you can be assured, that that provenance of that good is as it says. I think will be very, very powerful in terms of opening up new markets, but also creating that confidence with clients and customers and the end user. And within all that, all these different steps, you can introduce what I talked about earlier on around smart contract utilization. By the point of where the manufacturer, the store, the retailer sort of provides the store and they have to make payment. A smart contract can be written to ensure that happens, and the smart contract instructs, that, okay, now the goods have arrived, whatever it is, payment has to be made. And that is through smart contract. So very, very important in terms of the various steps and how you can see this chain, or this interaction across the value chain. Is very, very helpful in terms of bringing in the technology. The technology is not the magic wand necessarily, but it enables, it facilitates the access to creating value and opportunity for players to work together in a slightly more efficient manner. And the diagram across there shows, exemplifies that a little bit. So here we had a little video, which I think we wanted you to watch to just get a feel. It's a very short video to get a feel of what, how it works in terms of some of the supply chain respects. I hope it works and you can hear it.
Every day around the world, millions of shipping containers are in motion. An incredible achievement of logistics, coordination, and communication. But legacy data systems and manual document handling cause friction that costs both time and money for businesses and people throughout the supply chain. TradeLens is a digital shipping platform powered by blockchain that enables unprecedented transparency, collaboration, and efficiency in global supply chains. TradeLens provides control and management of shipping data and supplies innovative apps to every stakeholder in the supply chain: shippers, freight forwarders, intermodal operators, ocean carriers, ports, terminals, authorities, financial service providers, and more. To illustrate some of the ways TradeLens enables collaboration and reduces friction, let's follow a shipment of laptop computers from inland China to their final destination along the west coast of the United States. Using the document sharing capabilities of TradeLens, the shipper can submit shipping instructions to the carrier, who accesses the information to draft a bill of lading for the shipper's review. Once a final bill of lading is verified by the shipper and carrier, TradeLens makes it accessible to the customs broker, the authorities in the port of entry, and the cargo owner at the destination. All along the supply chain, access to shipping data and information is managed by TradeLens' sophisticated permissioning model that controls who can add, view, and update information at each stage of a shipment, and provides a blockchain encrypted audit trail of all critical actions. The benefits of TradeLens really deliver when the planned turns into the unplanned. Due to a sudden shift in inventory demand, the shipper requests the cargo be diverted to its distribution center in eastern US near Savannah, Georgia. Following the request, the shipment is rebooked on another vessel, requiring a change to the manifest and a reissued bill of lading. Using TradeLens, the carrier can create and publish the amended bill of lading to the platform for all permission parties to see. At the customs broker, the new information is updated into the shipment's import declaration for timely submission to US Customs. With TradeLens, any permission party can find the shipment through a range of search parameters, such as equipment number, bill of lading number, booking number, and more. Viewing the transport plan, they can see the key milestones on the shipment's timeline. TradeLens supports more than 120 planned, estimated, and actual events, all tracked instantaneously, giving detailed insights up and down the supply chain. In the case of this shipment, supply chain partners downstream are notified of the vessel change and are able to coordinate and manage the impact of the destination and timeline changes. Global trade is an incredibly complex system, but with TradeLens and blockchain technology, we now have a trusted solution to support industry-wide innovation. TradeLens, trade made easy.
Brilliant. I hope that helped. How is everybody feeling? Still can hear me? Everybody all right?
Yeah, good.
Fantastic. Great.
Yeah,
Thank
all
you very
good.
much.
All good. Thank you.
Thank
Good.
you. That's great. Yeah, so I mean, I think we can see from the video that just in
Can
case-
hear you. I can hear you. I think I'm getting more interest.
No, so I thought I'd share that video because it really kind of exemplifies in terms of the complexities that we have across the supply chain. You know, and I think TradeLens has really progressed quite well in sort of addressing some of those by leveraging technology. So I thought we'd share that. But yeah, there are kind of other, I hope I didn't miss a slide here. Yeah, okay. But there are other offerings. I mean, in terms, apart from just looking at the supply chain, you know, there are other offerings, I think, within blockchain that you can actually leverage the technology. For example, accounting and auditing. You know, the information that you have can be integrated into one document, updated in real time, and can be accessed by all sort of the network providers. And in accountancy, where you're dealing with a heavy paperwork and a whole range of different players, I think is very, very relevant in that field as well. Trade finance is very, very key one. You know, I think when you're looking at trade finance, I think trade finance is where you've actually seen quite a lot of usages of blockchain already. You know, the likes of Maersk, we've heard already in the video there, but the likes of Maersk and a whole range of others who've been trialing blockchain and using it for shipment. For example, even roses, avocados, these are perishable goods, for example. And therefore, in terms of the timeframes that are needed to meet delivery of these goods is very, very important. What they found in their plans, you know, in the 34-day process, that it normally involves a whole range of different actors, 30 or more, of 100 people and more than 200 interactions. By leveraging blockchain, that has helped to expedite things a little bit better and make things a little bit more transparent across all those different parties and the interactions as well, which is really, really helpful. So very, very cool in terms of trade finance. But this diagram, I really wanted to emphasize and showcase to everybody when you're dealing with documentation, especially in trade, as you can see, from this document, there's so many different players, but there are also so many different types of documents that you have to deal with. If you can automate a lot of these documentation, I think it saves a lot of time, but also helps in terms of providing a more efficient and value service, but also helps in the transparency aspects as well, because you have all these documentation. How do you do with each one of these? The time it takes by waiting on documentation to be to be verified or to be filled, that time is going and you're losing a lot of time, as well as costing quite a lot of money. So in terms of looking at digitalization, it has to kind of encompass end-to-end solutions where you're addressing it from point A to point B as well. We're looking at things like KYC, ML, which I've talked about already, payment confirmations, looking at weight and the certifications of origin and a whole range of other documents that we have to deal with. By digitizing a lot of this, I think there's value that you're creating in just digitizing that whole process. And here is just an example of the many documents, which I'm sure you're all familiar with in your fields. So the blockchain technology can actually help in this area. Now, in terms of challenges in trade finance, we really kind of highlighted some of the pinpoints. This was some research that's been done by, I think, Deloitte and a range of others, where they've really identified very, very clear in terms of areas where I think the technology can play a critical role. At the moment, there's a huge amount of organizations that are using sort of manual contract creation, sort of they're delaying payments for all sorts of the reasons I've outlined already. How they are also looking at sort of multiple versions of the truth or multiple versions of that record of transactions. Everybody's getting a different copy of Michelle's certificate. 1 minute Michelle is Dr. X, next minute she's a lawyer X. We all have different versions of the truth. I'm sending different versions and people are getting different versions. Therefore, it's very, very difficult to verify things. It takes a long time before you can agree and verify that, yes, this transaction is valid, because you have to look at a whole range of different things, and there are multiple versions of the truth, which makes it very, very difficult. Sort of duplicates as well. Repetitive tasks sometimes, of course, will lead to human error and a whole range of problems around bills of lading. For example, due to the inability of banks to verify the authenticity that I talked about, or to verify quick enough the authenticity that I talked about, can cost quite a lot of money. There are risks around things like compliance and a whole range of other areas. Other areas that we've outlined here: invoice factoring, delayed timeline, which all has massive, massive impact. And manual, AMI, and a whole range of other things, multiple platforms that different parties are engaging with, makes it very, very difficult, and then brings in that whole challenge around miscommunication, interpretation, and very much ripe for fraud and corruption to happen, because there's all this going on. But at the end of the day, what is being impacted across the supply chain, across the value chain? We're seeing so many different barriers that are being placed in place, which are costing money and resulting in very slow, process and delivery as well. So these pain points, these are some of the pain points that I think the technology actually helps with today. And a lot of the players within the industry are actually using blockchain a lot to try to address some of these pain points around trade finance. So what are the benefits of blockchain? I mean, many benefits of blockchain. And certainly when you look at sort of real time, reviewing any document related to trade finance on the platform can be reviewed to see the authenticity of that document in real time, as I said, as and when the process is happening, as I explained in my earlier diagram. Transparent factoring, very little intermediaries in between. The usage of smart contracts that are embedded within the process, helps the smart contracts to execute, to automate a lot of instructions that need to happen at certain points of the across the value chain or the supply chain. And of course, with the reduction of intermediaries and brokers and a whole range of different players in the middle, the risk of fraud is reduced. Instead, banks can now safely facilitate trade finance without issues or with less issues, because they're not dealing with so many different players, and they can validate things a little bit faster as well. No double spending as well, very, very critical. You're looking at, again, I've talked very much around smart contract execution. The status of the smart contract agreement will get updated as and when, in real time as we progress, and will reduce the need for that paperwork and that time that is committed. So instead, you can take your workforce that you've committed to try and look at these repetitive tasks to be doing a lot more other things within the organization, speeding up your operation and creating value in a faster manner. Proof of ownership, of course, as well, comes in very, very strongly. Blockchain can help to offer that proof of ownership by you placing that data onto the blockchain, which has, sort of cryptographically secure information that is linked on the blockchain. So all those numbers 12000, those are cryptography that secures that data you put onto the blockchain, can help in terms of identifying what belongs to who as well, which is very, very, very important. And helps in terms of that transparency around the location of the shipment. So if you want to track, as we saw in the video, you want to track and see where things are going and where there's been a problem, it's very, very easy to do that with the technology. But of course, regulation is still something that we are all kind of debating about. How do you get to border X and your goods are not moving because of the regulation in place, and you have to worry about, for example, in some countries, you have to worry about, kind of bribing the customs officer or whatever it is before your goods can be shipped from A to B, the delay that comes with that. Now, with technology and with blockchain coming into place, you can verify documentation. There isn't that many human interaction there. You can verify a lot of the process and automate a lot of the process, which leads to efficiency, which leads to reduction of fraud, which leads to, sort of speedier services as well. So who is playing in this field? There are many players, especially within sort of the trade sphere. This is something I pulled out from a report that was done recently of the different players within the network who are utilizing DLT. DLTs, they are distributed ledger technologies, and there are many types of distributed ledger technologies. And blockchain is one of these. They have similar characteristics and a whole range of other players. So there are many, many players within this field who are utilizing blockchain and trying to help with, especially with trade issues, the likes of WeTrade, Congo, and the whole range of others that are actually doing a lot around this space. The challenge, I think, is more around looking at the scalability of some of the solutions that are in place, and moving away from that proof of concept phase to actually looking at scalable solutions that can be deployed fully into the market. But there are a whole range of players, especially in the trade finance and supply chain finance spheres, who are doing quite a lot. Now, in terms of the futures around, more generally around digitization, I really want to kind of home in a little bit on this. Because as much as, yes, we have a tool, I like to think of blockchain as that tool that enables or creates trust, even in scenarios where it's very, very difficult to establish trust because you don't know who the parties are. So if you think of it as an opportunity to create trust, not necessarily trust from each other as humans or people, but creating trust through algorithms, creating trust through code, having that reassurance that this transaction has been verified and the right checks have been done before we've got this documentation. And certainly this documentation, this paper that I have that says it's Vishal, is authenticated and it's genuine and it's real. I think will help in terms of reassuring, especially when it comes to doing, dealing with different trade and a whole range of other things. So this slide is very much looking at the future. What does the future look like? What is happening within the blockchain space? Where is it actually applicable, and where are we seeing new innovation coming into place? Certainly around digital assets, I think is where we're going to see quite a lot of interaction. And when I say digital assets, digital assets is almost taking things like gold, for example, and digitizing the presentation of that gold and the value of that gold, and taking that value and trading that value, exchanging that value, through different mechanisms. You can use, cryptocurrency or Bitcoin, for example, as well, peg it to the digital assets. So tokenization is very, very important. And I think we're going to see a lot more tokenization. That process I described of where you're digitizing the assets and trading the assets is tokenization. Right. And when you're thinking about tokenization as a whole, what can you tokenize? What can you take? What physical assets in today do you have that you can take and give a digital representation of value? There are many things. I've put a map here of Africa and some of the resources that are available in the continent of Africa. Gold, can you digitize? Can you tokenize gold? Absolutely, yes. There are solutions in place already in the marketplace at the moment where we're looking at that. You're looking at different commodities as well, as I highlighted, but also you're able to, I think in future, I think maybe the banking industry, if it's not already happening, has massive opportunities around this. You can, for example, tokenize the data that you have around KYC and start to share that across the different banks. Yeah, obviously you have to work with your trusted network. This is more around things like private networks that you can look at tokenizing your KYC and sharing that information. You can tokenize maybe your due diligence activities as well. So placing that monetary value to access that data, which is secured on a blockchain. How do we do all that? How do we leverage opportunities that tokenization presents us? Healthcare data, very, very sensitive one when you're thinking about things like, privacy of data. And then data is a whole different avenue, and it would require another presentation for myself to really explain the value of data. But data is very, very valuable. A lot of people say that data is the new gold, but it really depends on the quality of data. Like I said, you can have huge amounts of data, which doesn't really mean anything. Or you can have really quality data that can help to inform and shape a lot of your business decisions, your new business modeling that you're thinking about. But at the same time, data is also helping, especially even now in the COVID crisis. One of the things that we are missing and lacking is that access to data and information. And this is where healthcare comes in very, very strongly. If you can have data sets that are stored securely, you're not necessarily sharing Michelle's information, that this is Michelle, this is all her healthcare information. But if I choose as the owner of that data, and I should be the owner of that data, if I choose that I want to share that data to enable researchers, scientists, a whole range of other people to look at, for example, vaccine for COVID-19, and there are data sets in there, there are controls in place that allow me to make that decision, to enable researchers or government or a whole range of different players to look at how they can utilize that data to inform and to make decisions and help in research. Then, I'd probably be more inclined to do that. But there are now mechanisms and tools that helps us to try and do that. So do we see a future where you're going to see patients, to use their data and tokenize their data? I think ultimately the debate here is very much around who owns the data, where's the data ownership lying, where's the control lying, very, very important. But tokenization is something that I think we're going to see a lot more of in future. And again, would be a very interesting topic that we can cover in a video detail, should that be of interest. And of course, I mentioned this a little bit earlier on, we're going to see a lot more new products, coming into place. The decentralized finance is already here. There's a number of players who are looking to centralize finance. There's an issue around what's happening within the economies as a whole. What's happening with people's, sort of reduction in terms of spending capability. When you look at decentralized finance, especially in certain markets where there's not that many options or choices to access finance, you can see opportunities for things like decentralized finance coming quite strongly. Opportunities in markets where a lot of people don't have access to bank accounts, cannot get bank accounts because there are very strict measures in place in order for you to secure that bank account. You can see the sort of decentralized products coming into play and really playing a critical role there. Now, how does that work in terms of, with the banking industry? How do you maybe work with the fintechs and a whole range of other players to offer more choices for customers, to offer more opportunity for customers? Because even post the COVID crisis, what does that look like now? In terms of utilizing physical money, where's going to be, is there going to be an appetite for people to be wanting to touch physical money, for example, now? The exchange of just physical money itself is a risk today. If you're thinking about the COVID crisis. What about central bank digital currencies? Is that the way forward? Certainly there's been discussions across the world, to analyze and say, okay, is this an opportunity now for decentralized finance, but also is this an opportunity for central bank digital currencies, for example, where nations can start to exchange that value in a form of currency between each other, because there's urgent need for finance, there's urgent need. There's no challenges around things like forex and foreign exchange issues. There's challenges at the moment around thinking about why is everybody so reliant on the dollar. Can we look at a distressed centralized finance opportunity to access digital currency for markets? So we're going to see a lot more of that coming out, and we're very much, of course, ourselves at the Global Policy House exploring how central bank digital currencies will play out. What does it mean in today's world of virtualization and digitization? How we're going to leverage money, use money, interact with money. Is it going to be still the case of where we're all leaning towards the bank to access our financing, or is there enough product choice for consumers now to actually move away? What does that actually mean for your business models as banks? Something to really think about. And here I will stop. And I decided today, I was meant to do the full PowerPoint, but decided today that it would be really good. I have some wonderful people working at my organization, and some people who've joined a very large training program. And I'm giving an opportunity to one of my leads at the company to actually cover a little bit of this around interoperability, which is a big, big issue. I think within blockchain space, we're still having challenges around interoperability as a whole, sort of blockchain to blockchain, but also that interoperability, looking at things like, back-end and front-end challenges that we have with the technology. So a lot of that is happening at the moment. And I wanted to just give an opportunity for my colleague to jump in here to talk a little bit about this. So Amit, I hope you can still hear me and you're there.
Thanks, Michelle, for the lovely, taking the best of the blockchain. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, loud and clear.
Hello.
I can hear you loud and clear.
Can everyone hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, you can hear you. We can hear you.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay, fine. Right. I'll be just sharing my screen now. Michelle, can you switch off the sharing of the screen because I can't do it from my end? Hello, Michelle. Can you turn off the screen sharing because I want to share the screen?
Have to go back into Zoom because I was just going to click your slides across.
Okay, that will be fantastic if you do the slides of mine.
Yeah,
So,
shall I do that?
Yeah, that will be perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Hold on a sec. I'll have to go back. Right. How's everybody feeling? I hope it's all fine. Let's see, present. So there you go, Meet. Can you see that?
Yep. Okay, perfect.
I just click. Just let me know when you want me to move to the next slide.
Sure. Okay, so I'll be taking you to the couple of topics, that is interoperability and the convergence of blockchain. So in simple terms, what does interoperability means? It means the capacity of computer system to exchange and make use of the information and capacity to transfer an asset between two or more systems while keeping the state and uniqueness of the asset consistent. Now, having said that, the second statement that I said is ideally, in blockchain, it is a bit complex because in blockchain, interoperability should allow knowledge to be shared without sending copies of data and provide fairness in the ordering of transaction and accessibility to data and codification. So basically, there are some challenges in terms of when it comes to blockchains of interoperability. Now, there are two types of blockchain interoperability. One is your digital asset exchange, and the second one is arbitrary data exchange. I'm going to show you on the next slide the examples. Yep. So now on the first figure, there's an illustration of a digital asset exchange where a Bitcoin is spent using the Ethereum decentralized application. So a trader is trading via Bitcoin on the app, which is built on Ethereum platform. So that's first. Now on the second figure, it illustrates how the ownership of bill of lading, which is arbitrary data, can be transferred from a shipper on Ethereum to a consignee on the different technology or a platform called Hyperledger. Okay, so there's a difference. So normally, on a global perspective, the arbitrary of data is important, and that's of a great use. Next slide, Michelle. Thank you. Okay, now this is the existing solution. Now this is the minimum viable ecosystem, meaning there's only one ecosystem where all the distributed network connected to the blockchain participate. So it takes you from your from retailer processing plant 1, plant 2, and the bank, how you get your money. It is all done on the blockchain itself, but it is still a unified ecosystem. On the next slide. Yeah, and now this is what we talk about, the challenges that comes on to the interoperability of the blockchain of blockchain. So you see there are like multiple ecosystems. So it's not unified right now. So basically every ecosystem needs to talk to the multiple ecosystem. So a Hyperledger fabric can talk to TLT on Ethereum, on R3 Cordova. So multiple entity talking to each other, and that's a great challenge because we need to be safe in terms of data sharing, because that's the challenge. On the next slide, I'll get you into more detail. Okay, now there are three types of interoperability. Now one is cross, the second is API. So, and third is your Oracle that we called. Now I'm going to talk about the API, which is much more, easier. So that's why I try to explain here the API-based interoperability solution. Now, if you check onto this, you will see, the bank corporate, carrier, and forwarder, terminal, and shipper. So you see those orange, these orange thing. So this API, now APIs are the pieces of code which is written in a form of script. Now script talks to the server, and a server in turn gets access to the database. Now, and the database has to be accessible by that API only when it adheres to the developers, protocols. So one API on a one system of the DLT node. Now this could work on two-way. Number one, you see this orange two-way communication, and then the green. So either you can use orange, meaning the APIs can call another APIs onto the different system of the carrier consortium, and in turn, again, the forwarder system, and then finally to the shipper. So APIs can talk to each other, bring on the data, and then show it to the interface. Now, this is one system, or you have individual APIs working on a unified system, and then you have on a top level, you have a DLT node. Now the DLT node can in turn, again, talk to the different DLT node. So it's kind of either you use APIs or the DLT. Next slide, please. Okay, now there is a use case of interoperability. Now, it says Deloitte has connected Hyperledger Fabric, which is one of the chain of Hyperledger consortium backed by IBM and different open source platform. Now, it takes Deloitte has connected Hyperledger Fabric and Ethereum with Singapore Exchange and Monetary Authority of Singapore, the Central Bank of Singapore by node integration. What they have done is basically Deloitte has used a smart contract, chain node of Hyperledger Fabric to trigger a payment at Ethereum network upon the change of the titles of security. So when you trade on the Singapore Exchange, the seller first receives a secret code from Singapore Exchange server to lock the securities on the Hyperledger Fabric. Now, which in turn validates the ownership of the securities against the seller. Now, the Singapore Exchange server again sends the secret code to the buyer this time to lock their payment, which is built on Ethereum network. And the event is triggered in a form of smart contract. And the event triggers at the same time where the buyers and seller can simultaneously open the secret and can trade each other. So that's the use case of interoperability, how it works. Next slide, please. Yeah. And these are the challenges, basically. So we have infrastructure development challenge and universality. Basically, we still lack the robust infrastructure. Sometimes one consortium agrees, to support the other consortium, but other consortium may not agree to support the first. So there are challenges in terms of infrastructure and universality, which is required basically to disrupt this sector. Next slide. And these are the use cases. Citibank, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of New York, and Goldman Sachs, they've all used cryptocurrencies basically in terms of their banking branches to streamline some of the processes. And one of the good use case is that the country Japan. Now Japan has 75% of its bank use Ripple as a platform for the exchange rate conversion and forex exchange transfers. So they've utilized 75% of the banking onto the Ripple, and they are in talks with Swift as well. So Swift is collaborating with Ripple as well to construct a new platform. So we'll hear the news, sometime sooner in a couple of months as well. Next slide, Michelle, please.
Sure.
Okay, now we come on to the convergence opportunities. So the convergence opportunity with Internet of Things and IoT and blockchain. So how does three things mix together, or two things mix together? So what is IoT? IoT is basically, it's a network which talks to the devices basically built on RFID code. The best example I could give is you've all have heard about Amazon Alexa. So that's kind of a Internet of Things. So when your fridge or your AC can talk to your device or mobile app, there are many AC manufacturer who provide you the mobile app. You can switch on your AC from or the heater from your mobile app while you're in the office, while you're going back to the home, so that you can turn on your oven, your toaster, so that your toaster get ready and you get a good grilled sandwich, so on. So that's the Internet of Things. But how does it work with blockchain? So there's a convergence opportunity with these two technologies, because these two are the emerging technologies. So when we use IoT and blockchain together, it will definitely disturb the future technologies. So basically, yeah, thank you. Again, the blockchain can help supporting the development of decentralized open market for AI, training data. Blockchain can be used to identify and permanently record individual data point. So when we collect the data, like the behavior pattern. So for example, if me, Amit Gupta, is using my let's say refrigerator 24/7, or is using my peak electricity when I go back to home at 6 p.m. UK time, let's say. So that point of time, X amount of the electricity is being consumed. So that data is recorded, on the blockchain. So, and it gives you the behavioral pattern in terms of my age, my nativeness, and so on. So actually it gives you a whole picture, like what kind of person you are, and that could be recorded on the blockchain, which in turn could be used in the healthcare and different data sets. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amit. That was great coverage. But yeah, just to kind of finalize, I'm conscious of time as well. We've covered quite a lot very, very quickly. And I know there might be some questions at the end. So I will just rush through the next couple of slides. There's only a couple more left. But just to kind of pick up on what Amit was saying in terms of interoperability, that's one of the biggest challenges I think we have, but also around governance structures. So governance is a big, big issue within blockchain. How do we start to govern? How do we embed governance structures? How do we standardize, what is on offer is something to also bear in mind, but that's certainly a conversation for another presentation. And just to wrap up, I think, in terms of just looking holistically as a whole, what is needed in terms of success for digital futures? We are living in a digital era. There's a whole range of things that we have to think about. We've touched on very, very, very briefly today on the opportunities with blockchain. And this is just a minute, coverage. But certainly there are other things that we have to consider around things like infrastructure availability, digital platforms that are available, the talent, the skills that are needed to enable these digital structures to happen, the education, the e-commerce activity that is going on, and how we harmonize that and help to look at, tools to enable more faster, e-commerce, digital trade, and a whole range of other things. Now, very, very important around the convergence element. So how do we start to look at convergence as well is very, very key. We've talked about, the linkages that you have between AI and blockchain as well. AI is going to be part of normal everyday life. How do we start leveraging that? How does that work in part blockchain and IoT and other technologies? We have the likelihood of things like, quantum computing coming ahead and almost kind of challenging the concepts we have around maybe security as well as speed with blockchain and other things. Robotics, what does that mean? So there's a whole range of things I think we need to consider in terms of digital futures, and as organizations, as you're planning strategically and moving ahead, you have to consider how this will all impact, or how you can leverage this to better your business models as well. So what would drive digital futures? I think of, sort of the digital economy as a whole, many, many things. And a lot of banking industry players are very much engaged with blockchain, are playing around with blockchain. A lot of them are investing in blockchain. And I think there's been real value that is starting to be recognized with leveraging blockchain, especially now with the supply chain and COVID and what's happening around COVID. So you're going to see a lot more new markets, but you're going to also see a stable flow of companies and organizations who are really seeing opportunities with blockchain, and it's not going to be everybody. And that's when we're going to start seeing more growth and scalability around these areas. Of course, value creation. I emphasized earlier on, that supply chain end-to-end digitization is very, very important. You cannot just digitize one element, just a bill of lading, and forget everything else. There's no value, I think, in that. Of course, it's a process and there's stages to it, but the real value will come from sort of that end-to-end digitization. And just to wrap up, so yes, you can see here in terms of growth and traction, certainly the blockchain industry is growing, and we still predict it's going to grow. Not necessarily Bitcoin, everyone. I'm not a hater of Bitcoin, but we just have to understand the variations between the two. In terms of blockchain, that underlying technology, that mother technology has a lot more to offer, and you're going to see a lot more innovation coming out of the blockchain, like tokenization and a whole range of other things. And of course, I mean, looking at just this device, the mobile phone, is very, very powerful too. There are many, decentralized apps that will come in that will be put onto this little device, where you will see a lot of people who are utilizing blockchain-based applications on your mobiles, on your tablets, and a whole range of other areas. But you don't necessarily have to know that it's a blockchain-based, or you won't be referring to it as, oh, hi, Michelle, I'm using a blockchain-based, app. Nice to talk to you. No. The future is very, very much around connectivity, around IoT, and using devices and connecting. Very, very powerful. But this tool is very, very important. How is the banking industry leveraging this tool, for example, and looking at online and digitization as a whole? And just to wrap up, I mean, at the Global Policy House, we do help, companies, organizations. We've been mainly working with governments, the UN, and a whole range of other groups, IBM and other players within the technology field, to actually help to educate around what does it actually mean, to look at things like emerging technologies. How can you utilize them? How can you start to look at strategies, your business strategies, your business models, to understand how to leverage these technologies. And here I've highlighted, I won't go through it in detail in the interest of time, but this is the reason why we are focusing a lot around the education element, because we feel there's a lack of understanding of how to actually leverage the technology and to understand how the technology works and what it actually means for businesses and different parties and different groups. So this is one of the areas that we focus on at the Policy House. And of course, we work in partnership, as I mentioned earlier, with a whole range of different players, academics, international organizations like the ICC, the IBM, the African Union, World Trade Organization, and a whole range of others, to really start to, bring in some credibility as well around this space and start to create opportunities, start to help businesses and different players within the field to actually leverage opportunities with this technology and others in mind. And of course, our focus, as I said, is blockchain. We look at executive education programs for business leaders. We've done this across the globe. We've been, places like Singapore, Australia, Africa, everywhere, the UK as well. Provide different training for women, blockchain for young people, and blockchain education more widely. I've left a bit of information on myself, and Amit, of course, will also share his details later on. I put him into this presentation rather late, but we will definitely share our emails and everything if you need to have a bit more information. And here's a bit of background and some information for you to get hold of myself, and if you want to reach out to the team. And thank you very much. I feel like it was a little bit rushed towards the end, but we certainly can provide, for those who are interested, we certainly can provide a lot more insight. And I think there's so many topics we've touched up on today, giving very, very brief details, and would be more than happy to elaborate if people are interested. Thank you so much. John, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I think it's a very, very detailed presentation, and it's really much appreciated. We just want to have a little session where we could have some question Q&A session before we wrap up today. But I think I'm happy to raise the first question. I know you talked about blockchain being a form of decentralized ledger technology, whereby data are stored in blocks of data and they're linked via cryptography. The question someone will ask is, how secure is the blockchain? Can it be hacked into? Just like we have internet today, and we have cases of it being hacked and all that. Is it a more secure form of communication than emails or some website or something like that?
Sure. Thanks, John, for that question. Really important one. I think going back to my earlier description on what blockchain is, or the characteristics, that formulate blockchain. So with blockchain, rather than where you have one single point of verification, if you like, authentication, where you're getting it from either one entity, one company, one bank, or one government group. With blockchain, how it works is you have to gain consensus or agreement from a range of different people within the network. So, if you have, I don't know, 50 banks who are operating within a private blockchain, like I explained earlier on, that private blockchain will be given, the members within that private blockchain will have access to that network and will have to verify the transactions that happen on that network. So it's not one bank that is verifying that information. And because you have to get everybody's consensus or agreement that this particular transaction is valid, it creates a lot more security behind it. So yes, it's a bit more secure, than, for example, a traditional database where you have that single point, that single point of failure. So even if something goes wrong, there's that single point of failure. Whereas in blockchain, it's a little bit spread out. So the risk is also spread out because you have to gain that consensus or that agreement. Now look at a Bitcoin network, which is a public blockchain. There's so many transactions, so many players across the Bitcoin network. You have to gain consensus from a whole range of different players. So if something goes wrong, it's kind of very easy to verify where that's going wrong, and it's very difficult to kind of hack almost every single block of data that exists on the Bitcoin network, if that makes sense. So because of that, it makes it a little bit more secure. Is it 100% secure, as in it can never be hacked? I personally like to disagree on that, because I think you can't really always say something is 100% secure. I think there's room, for opportunities to hack in the future. And certainly when you have new technologies like quantum computing coming in, and the speed at which computers will be working in the future through quantum and a whole range of other issues, there's a question mark around the full security around blockchain. But yeah, I think in terms of, it offers a lot more security than traditional.
Just one more question. How do we relate this to our jobs? Is it related to just maybe banking, or is it related to anything we do? And how do we translate this and begin to think about in our day-to-day jobs? How do we create sensitization for concerning blockchain or emerging technology and what we do? Is it just related to banking, or is it other aspects of or other industries as well? Is it related to other aspects as well?
Sure, absolutely. No, I think this is certainly not just a banking, solution. There are many opportunities, I think, for banking to leverage blockchain, especially when you look at things like data sharing. Like I said earlier on, some of the hints I was giving in there, without giving too much detail around the tokenization of, for example, your KYC information, your AML processing, your documentation, and maybe automizing that and storing information onto the blockchains, huge opportunities, but those are not the only opportunities. Certainly, it's not just for banking. I think banking, we've already seen numerous use cases where banks are actually leveraging the technology. In fact, in many countries across the world, I was in Taiwan. In Taiwan, banks and fintechs are very, very closely linked and are working very, closely with each other to provide a range of services and products for the end user, for the customer. So banks can partner, for example, with the fintechs to provide certain products that the banks cannot offer because of the regulations or the issues around compliance, which restricts banks from offering certain products and services. But that does not limit you from partnering, with fintechs, for example. So there are massive opportunities, I think, on the banking side, but let's not kid ourselves. This solution is not just for banking. We're looking at healthcare. We're looking at identity management. We're looking at property rights, land titles, and a whole range of other things that you can place on the blockchain and start giving identity to things as well. So not just identity to Michelle and giving me that unique cryptographically secure identity, which gives me reassurance that my data is secure, is stored on this platform. But also you're starting to give identity to assets, and I think there's real value there, I think, for banks when you're dealing and trading assets, for example. How are you starting to look at assets slightly different? How are you trading assets slightly different? How are you looking at those loans, derivatives and a whole range of other areas slightly different by innovating with the technology? So there are massive opportunities, but let's not kid ourselves. It's not an answer to every sector. There are very clear sectors where you could utilize blockchain and where we're seeing some advantages. Energy, the decentralization of energy sources, huge, especially for emerging markets and a whole range of other areas. You're looking at energy, you're looking at identity, you're looking at land titles, you're looking at real estate and a whole range of other things. So it's certainly not just for banking, but I think for banks, it's real time now to sit back within your organization to say, look, how do we innovate? How do we start to provide products and services that are actually more tailored to the end user, to the customer? You've got younger people now who are engaging purely on their mobiles, and on their tablets, and they're doing all their, their banking and a whole range of other things online. How are you catering to that market? How are you leveraging the tools that are there? And blockchain is just one tool. There are many others. How are you using that technology to reach your customer? Do you understand the protocols that are behind the technology so that you can maybe design right from design phase, as in early? There are 3 layers to blockchain. There's a protocol layer where you have the coding that's being done. You have the networking layer, you've got the application layer. How are you engaging across those 3 different layers to create products and services that are actually needed for the marketplace and for the different categories in the marketplace, for the younger, for the older generation? How are you including them? How are you designing products starting from the end user, right, and designing them that way? I think is very important. And part of the answer to that is partnership.
Okay. I have a couple of questions I can see on the chat. I think someone asked how you've evolved into this role. You seem to be, well, people claim you seem to be quite fancy. How do you get so knowledgeable, in terms of this technology? I think that's one question which I've seen in that's been asked. Another person asked a question. Another person, just let me share 2 in one. In terms of what is the relevance of blockchain on the education sector? It's an institution where you have 15 banks and consensus, or basically what's the relevance of blockchain in the education sector?
Sure.
And also how you emerge into this role, what you're doing right now.
Sure. Fantastic. Thanks, John. I'll take the first one a bit later on in terms of how I evolved into the role, and talk a bit more around the relevance of blockchain in education. Huge relevance. I'll give you just an example. My team and I, and Amit, I hope you're still on the call, but my team and I have actually just designed a new education program for kids. So we've been thinking a lot around, actually, because so many children who are at home, parents are frustrated about homeschooling. They don't know how to, why am I teaching them today, tomorrow? And then a lot of the learnings are actually focused more on traditional subjects, maths, which are all very, very important. But we're not skilling up the next generation with the emerging technologies, for example. So in terms of education, how can we ensure that many children are starting to get the right education? How are we collecting the data to understand how children are responding to education programs? Can we collect that data? Can we place that data onto blockchain, for example? Can we design, blockchain-based platforms where more learning? These kids to go and use blockchain to actually learn a little bit more. So one of the areas that we thought of is around gamification. So by a lot of kids play Fortnite, in a whole range of different games. They're on their PCs, they're playing Fortnite. How much learning are they getting out of that? You can actually create, blockchain. In fact, a mashup of different technologies, AI, blockchain, robotics, where you can start teaching kids and recording that information and that data onto the blockchain. This is not private information about the children, but it's actually about the data in terms of how many kids have we taught, what are the subjects we're teaching. We can almost kind of monitor using gamification, teaching them certain skills as they play games, right? So teaching them about blockchain, teaching them about AI, teaching them about robotics as they play the games. So that's one way, I think, in terms of education. But also in education, when you look at universities, how do you authenticate diplomas and certificates that come out of different universities? A lot of people have used fraudulent certificates and diplomas and have claimed, yes, I've got a master's of this and that. How do you verify that document? Yeah, I think technology, the blockchain certainly can help in areas like that, and there are already use cases in place at the moment looking at that. So there are many ways to utilize blockchain. I think in education is pretty powerful, and now we're going to see a lot more virtual learning and digital learning, and not out of choice, because obviously with the COVID crisis now, that one-to-one teacher in classroom, there's a lot of that is not going to happen as it happened in the past. So we really need to start to understand how can we leverage that technology or that storage of information to start teaching the children, as well as how can we get robotics, for example. How do kids start to understand how robots work? Can they design their own robots? Of course they can, but they need to understand how to try and do this. So it's really, really interesting around it. Passionate about it. Now, the first question in terms of how I evolved into the role, yeah, it's an interesting one. I used to be in banking myself, actually. So I spent quite some time in the city, London, UK, working for UK Finance around the corporate finance division. I did quite a lot of work, but I just generated my own interest, and I felt I came across the Satoshi paper, which talked more around cryptocurrency around 2009. And I kind of fell, I almost fell in love with it because I started getting very excited, thinking, oh, wow, there's a new way of dealing with money. I've always been quite fascinated about money and how you get money from A to B. At the BBA, which is what it was called at the time, not UK Finance, I was always quite happy and fascinated to help businesses access capital and liquidity, and support that. And I noticed quite a lot how difficult it was for especially small businesses to access capital. So for me, when I read the Satoshi paper, I kind of almost saw it as an opportunity for sort of players who cannot access traditional systems to be able to play and access money, to be able to go and really be creative around money. So I almost kind of fell into it, really. And then I did my own research at blockchain. And it's been quite some time now, since about 2009. And then I was also involved here locally with the University of Surrey, where we did quite a lot of research with professors here on understanding DLT and cryptography as well, and how that works. So cryptography has been in existence for quite a long time, and the concept of blockchain, really interested me because I looked at this decentralized, mode of doing things, which gave a bit more opportunities for many different players to come in and interact with the system, be the financial system. So it's been an interest of mine for some time. I've invested quite a lot in learning about it myself, but I've also studied as well, to formalize my understanding with the University of Oxford more recently. But generally, most of it has been through my own interest and just building up my knowledge as well and creating my company.
Okay, thanks. Just two more questions. I have a question from Oluwase Dada, and she asked, my question is, how can existing companies whose main records are manual, as in paper records, can be migrated into a blockchain? Then another question was, is regarding GDPR. GDPR and blockchain. So how does blockchain solve or address the problem of GDPR? Who will be held responsible for data breach?
Yeah, two very, very good questions. I think on the GDPR one, certainly an area where there's a lot of debate around, this goes back to my issue around the legality and governance structure. So, where does the fault or accountability lie? It's something that certainly we're still very much debating on within the industry. But in terms of we talk about things like, the right to be forgotten, for example. How do you ensure that data is not compromised when you're putting it on the blockchain? It goes back to my point around how it really depends what you're sharing. You don't necessarily have to share everything about me, my personal information. For example, you have certain algorithms or code that's created that links me to the blockchain, but that doesn't necessarily give, for example, if I'm on the Bitcoin network, it doesn't give away my name and my address of where I'm living, but I have a set of numbers or a key that is allocated to myself, which does not reveal everything. So there's that debate around, okay, where does it lie in terms of the legality of things? And that's something I think that's still very, very much debated. And that's where we're thinking about things like regulation and how do we bring in regulation in the market as well to ensure that we protect consumers, we ensure we protect data. But a lot of it also goes back to my point around data, and who owns the data. Who owns the data, who governs on the data. Very, very important. In today's world, to be honest with you, a lot of large organizations own a lot of data, our data. We don't necessarily have that much control in terms of the data that we have, but we are all advocating by the use of these technologies to have a lot more control on data. And I think by the time you have a lot more control in data usages, then you can also kind of self-govern and self-control what happens on a lot of the networks. So I think there's still a very open debate around GDPR, and Amit, if you want to add anything else, please do so afterwards. But there is still very much a lot of debate around that. And I think, Amit, you touched up a little bit on the arbitrary data that you talked about earlier on, a very, very important point as well. But just to answer the other lady's question around how do you get augmentation into a blockchain, that's one of the most significant use cases where you're dealing with a lot of documents. You know, you can kind of take that document, whether you scanned or whatever it is, and put that information onto the blockchain. And once it's on the blockchain, it is there on the blockchain. It is not going to be easily removed. So you also have to be careful in terms of information that you are storing on the blockchain, because it's going to stay on the blockchain, right? And the quality of information or data that you're inputting, you know, still has to be validated and authenticated from somewhere, right? So the quality of information that you are placing on the data also matters. But you can certainly, you know, digitize and automate a lot of the documents that you have, or the information, the data that you have about certain things that you can place on the blockchain. And then you can link that to ownership, which is what I was saying earlier on. So that key that I have, that set of numbers that I have that is linked to Michelle, and I have land, I have property that I own in Zambia, my home country, or Ethiopia, my other place, you know, I can then go securely, happy to say, oh, yeah, this land is mine. It's not a case of I'm fighting with my relatives or a million other people say, oh no, that land doesn't belong to you, this belongs. It is pegged and linked to my identity as well and put it onto blockchain. Very, very powerful. So depending on what information you have to share. Amit, I don't know if you want to add anything on the GDPR stuff.
Yeah, sure. Why not? On the GDPR, basically, see, I was reading, a couple of days ago. I think it says point number 17 on the GDPR, which I think blockchain companies are actually, wanted to comply with that. But again, it depends, like what the regulators have to say, because if blockchain, consortium, they wanted to, comply with the GDPR, actually, then, the mining thing, it needs a huge amount of computing power. So it requires a whole lot of, money to flow in, and plus it makes the system slow as well. So they are still in talks with them. But if you see on the backside of it, the GDPR is again like saving your data. Now, I'll give a simple example. So we know that Google owns the data, obviously, and obviously now the Facebook owns us as well, because there were like data breaches of the Facebooks and likes of big players revealing our data to the US companies. Chinese on the other side, they have they can take our data as well from their manufactured phone. So then only the GDPR came in. But the example that I want to give you is, if you just check Brave browser, that we have Google Chrome. Now, Brave browser is built on Web 3.0, which means it does not let Google or any company track you unless and until you permit it. So what I personally do is, and it's for you all as well, if you want to browse anything, browse on Brave, Brave browser, you can see it. And they own Brave coin as well. So if you want to Brave coin, you can, but I will not go into the details of the cryptocurrency, but it's built on Web 3.0. So your data is actually safe, and it has got an incognito window, which is actually the foolproof. So there's a difference between Google Chrome or likes of Safari and IE, Microsoft Edge, and this particular thing. So that's the difference between a GDPR and the blockchain, how it can actually correlate. It's actually correlating, but the government, the regulators need more friendly regulations in terms of comparing it with blockchain. Also, coming on to the part where there was another question of getting everything to the decentralized application, the paper. So like Michelle's rightly actually said, what you can do is digitize everything, scan, put it in terms of a disk, and let that disk access to the decentralized application. So everything goes onto that particular database. And now it depends. Like I said, there are two types of blockchain application. One is the permission, where you need a permission. The other one is permissionless, which is open. So you don't need a permissionless here. You don't want your company data to be revealed to anyone. You just need your company data to be accessed by either few players or all the players, depending upon what information they want to see. Say, for example, the HR just want to see the payroll, but not the normal, service engineer, so that's how you actually build the application, and that involves a whole lot of coding as well. And it depends, like, so there are a lot of things to be chosen for. For example, the technology wise, the backend. What technology do I need, or do I really need the blockchain application to be implemented on my native or traditional application? So that's the question as well. Thank you. I mean, I hope I can go on and on, but
No.
there's a shortage of time, so I'll just stop myself here.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I think we'll make a stop now. But I just want to thank everyone for coming, joining today. We want to make this a more a regular thing. This is the first that is being done, hosted by LikeMinds. I don't mention about LikeMinds, but we are an African network of professionals that are based in the city. Most of us are bankers, and we come together on a quarterly basis, and we network, and we provide ourselves support for job opportunities and other form of networking opportunities. So we decided to do this presentation, and we engage the services of the Policy House to do this presentation. So we hope that we want to make this a more regular thing, at least once a month. And just thanks again to Michelle. I know you mentioned a few other emerging technologies. You did mention about Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, which is also linked to machine learning. We want to hope that the next session, we want to do another session in 3-4 weeks' time. It will be focusing on artificial intelligence. That's another huge area of emerging technology which we can explore, which will be useful for us and to our organizations also. So if you want to know a little bit more, feel free to drop me an email, LikeMinds88@gmail.com. I'm happy to link you up with Michelle. And if you think you might need some Policy also does some form of consultancy services also. And if you think your organization is in need of digitizing their offering, and you think that you need someone to come in to talk to them to sensitize and think about optimating their solutions, feel free to let me know. I'm happy to link you up with Michelle, and he could come to your company and give a talk to senior management. I think the slides did capture all those information. So we will send more information in the next couple of weeks into the next presentation, which we'll be looking at doing. If Michelle is free, she can also help us with that as well. I'm putting her legs down. But we're going to be looking at more on machine learning and artificial intelligence. So, well, thanks again for everyone for joining. I know we've exceeded time, but thanks again, and stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you, LikeMinds, for bringing this to us. We appreciate it. Bye.
Thank you. All right.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Good night.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
All right.
thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks, Amit. Appreciate it.
Thank you.